September 1944, Arnhem, the Netherlands. Private First Class Dale Robbins of the American 82nd Airborne Division stood at the edge of a bombed-out road and watched something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. Across the river, a small cluster of British paratroopers had just repelled their fourth German assault of the morning. They were running low on ammunition. Their officer was wounded. Two of their positions were already on fire, and yet not a single man had moved backward. Not one. Robbins turned to the sergeant standing beside him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. What he was watching didn't fit inside any frame of reference he had. He had fought in Normandy. He had pushed across France. He thought he understood what elite soldiers looked like. He was wrong. The story of Arnhem has been told many times. The bridge too far, the 9-day battle, the 1st British Airborne Division dropped into the path of 2 SS Panzer divisions and nearly wiped out. Most tellings focus on the tragedy, the intelligence failures, the delays, the weather, the radios that didn't work, the plans that fell apart within hours of the first boots hitting the ground. All of that is true and all of it matters. But there is another layer to the story that almost never gets told. What the Americans who were close enough to see it said afterwards. What they wrote in letters home, in after-action reports, in memoirs published decades later. Because the American soldiers who operated around the edges of Market Garden, who listened on radios, who looked across the Rhine and watched through binoculars, came away from Arnhem changed. Not by the failure of the operation, by the men who refused to accept it. The plan for Operation Market Garden was audacious in a way that even the men who devised it found difficult to fully articulate. 3 airborne divisions would drop in sequence along a corridor stretching 60 miles into Holland. The 101st American Airborne would secure the southernmost objectives around Eindhoven. The 82nd American Airborne would hold the middle section, including the critical bridge at Nijmegen. And at the far end of the corridor, 60 miles from the nearest friendly ground forces, the British First Airborne Division would drop near Arnhem and seize the road bridge over the Rhine. Then British Reichsix Corps would drive up the single road connecting all of it, relieve each division in turn, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and pour into the open German plains beyond. 6 weeks later, the thinking went, the war would be over. The 82nd and 101st knew their roles. They had trained for exactly this kind of operation. Seize and hold, fight until the armour arrived. They understood the theory. What no one had fully prepared them for was watching the British at the far end of the corridor do something that existed outside any training manual they had ever read. Sergeant Roy Fitzgerald of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne, wrote in his diary on the 20th of September 1944, 4 days into the battle. He had been listening to radio traffic from British First Airborne for 3 days. The reports were coming in broken and intermittent, equipment failing in the rain, but enough was getting through to understand the picture. He wrote simply, "Those men at Arnhem are not fighting to win anymore. They are fighting because stopping has not occurred to them. I do not know what to do with that." Fitzgerald was not an impressionable young soldier easily given to admiration. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He had fought at Groesbeek and along the Maas-Waal Canal. He was 26 years old and had seen more combat than most soldiers 3 times his age. And something in what he was hearing over that radio was getting under his skin in a way artillery never had. What the British were doing at Arnhem was not, on paper, rational. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion had seized the northern end of the Arnhem Road Bridge and was holding it against everything the Germans could bring to bear. By the time Fitzgerald wrote those words in his diary, Frost's men had been fighting continuously for 96 hours. They had run out of most of their ammunition. Their medical supplies were exhausted. The buildings they occupied were burning around them. German tanks were firing directly into the walls at point-blank range. SS infantry had been conducting assault after assault for 4 days, taking horrific casualties each time, and still the bridge held. This was the part that reached the American soldiers. Not the tactics, not the ground-level detail. The sheer fact of it. Men holding a position with no prospect of relief, no realistic hope of survival, no logical reason to keep fighting, and they kept fighting anyway. Corporal James Hewitt of the 101st Airborne, stationed south of Eindhoven, heard about Arnhem from a British liaison officer who came through their position on the 21st of September. He recalled that conversation in a memoir written in 1979. The liaison officer was a young captain, very calm, very precise. He explained the situation at Arnhem the way you might describe the weather, factually, without drama. He said Frost's battalion was encircled, down to perhaps 150 effective men, and was not expected to hold much longer. Then he said something that Hewitt never forgot. He said, "They know. They have known since the second day. They are still there." Hewitt asked him why. The captain looked at him for a moment and said, "Because the bridge is still the bridge." That answer made no sense to Hewitt at the time. It made more sense to him later. The bridge was still the objective, regardless of what had happened around it. The situation had changed. The mission had not. British airborne doctrine in the Second World War was built around a concept so fundamental to how its soldiers thought that it had become almost invisible to them. The objective was not negotiable. Circumstances were variables. The objective was a constant. You held it until you were physically incapable of holding it. Not until it became difficult. Not until it became dangerous. Until the last possible moment of the last possible man. American airborne doctrine was different. Not worse, different. The 82nd and 101st were trained to seize objectives rapidly, hold them until relief arrived, and then integrate into a broader conventional operation. Flexibility was a virtue. Adapting to changing circumstances was a mark of professional soldiering. If a position became untenable, you extracted, regrouped, and attacked again. Preserving the fighting force was part of preserving the mission. This worked. It had worked in Sicily, in Normandy, across France. It was sound military thinking, but it meant that what was happening at Arnhem looked, from the American perspective, like something beyond ordinary military behaviour. It looked like men choosing to die rather than retreat, and the Americans watching from a distance couldn't quite work out whether it was the bravest thing they had ever seen or something they lacked the vocabulary to categorise at all. Lieutenant Robert Wierzbowski of the 101st Airborne, who had spent several days fighting near Sun and Best before the corridor began to stabilise, wrote a letter to his brother in October 1944, shortly after the survivors of 1st Airborne were evacuated back across the Rhine. He had spoken to some of those survivors after they came through. He wrote, "I talked to some of the boys from the British Division today. They don't look broken. That's what gets you. They look tired. They look like men who've been through something, but they don't look beaten." I asked one of them, a sergeant, what it was like inside the perimeter at the end. He thought about it for a long time and said, "Noisy." That was the whole answer. Noisy. I didn't push it. I didn't think I had the right to. That encounter stayed with Wierzbowski. He wrote about it again in a memoir published in 1971. By then, he had had 27 years to think about what it meant. He concluded that the British sergeant's answer was not reticence. It was precision. He had described what he could describe. The rest was not something that translated into words for a man standing outside it. What the American soldiers were encountering, in those conversations and in the radio intercepts and in the after-action reports that circulated through XXX Corps and the airborne divisions in the weeks following, was a cultural fact about how the British First Airborne had been built and what it had been built to do. Major General Roy Urquhart's division was the product of years of doctrine developed in the shadow of defeat. The British had been beaten at Dunkirk, beaten in Greece, beaten in Crete. They had built their airborne force in the knowledge that airborne operations were inherently desperate, that things would go wrong, that soldiers would find themselves isolated and outnumbered. They had built men accordingly, men who did not require good news to keep functioning, men who could absorb catastrophe and continue, not because they had no fear, because they had decided in advance that fear was not a variable that affected the outcome. Sergeant First Class Harold Cooper of the 500 4th Parachute Infantry told an interviewer for an American Veterans Oral History Project in 1968 what he remembered about the days after Arnhem. He'd been at Nijmegen when the bridge was finally taken on the 20th of September, and he had watched the Irish Guards' armoured column move north toward Arnhem knowing it was too late. He said, "We were all quiet that day. You didn't need to know the details to know what was happening up there. The radio traffic told you enough." These British guys had been fighting alone for a week. We had taken the Nijmegen Bridge, we'd done our job, and now we were sitting here, and we knew they were still up there, and we couldn't get to them in time. That's a particular kind of feeling, it stays with you, Cooper was asked. Whether he thought the British had made a mistake by not withdrawing earlier. He paused before answering. He said, I've asked myself that question for 24 years, and every time I ask it, I come back to the same place. They weren't fighting a mistake. They were fighting a bridge. Whether I would have done the same thing, I honestly couldn't tell you, but I'm not sure that's the right question. The right question is, did they know what they were doing? And yes, they knew exactly what they were doing. What Cooper was circling around was something that emerged again and again in American accounts of Arnhem. A recognition that what the British First Airborne had done was not accidental, or emotional, or born from confusion. It was deliberate, considered. The men in that perimeter understood their situation precisely. By the third day, they knew relief was not coming in time. By the fourth day, many of them knew the operation had failed strategically. None of that changed anything. The position was held. The wounded were treated in cellars under constant fire. Officers moved between positions calmly. NCOs held their men together using nothing but presence and voice. The perimeter contracted, but it did not collapse. It had to be physically taken apart by SS infantry and armour over 9 days of grinding, methodical, incredibly costly fighting. The Germans suffered approximately 3,000 casualties, taking back a position held by fewer than 10,000 men, a force that was itself running on empty by the second day. The SS divisions involved, the 9th Hohenstaufen and the 10th Frundsberg, were veteran elite formations. They took those casualties from men with no artillery support, almost no armour, failing radios, and eventually almost no ammunition. American veterans who later read the German after-action reports were struck by how the German accounts echoed their own. The language was different, but the bewilderment was the same. A German officer's report captured after the war described the fighting in the Oosterbeek perimeter as unlike anything encountered in previous combat on either the Eastern or Western Front. Not because of firepower, because of what happened when firepower ran out. British soldiers continued, with whatever was available, with bayonets if necessary, with entrenching tools. The report concluded that the psychological character of the British First Airborne soldier appeared to exist in a category separate from conventional military analysis. Private First Class Dale Robbins, the man we began with, survived the war. He went home to Indiana in 1945 and spent 30 years working in a machine tool factory before retiring. In 1983, he gave an interview to a local newspaper for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. The journalist asked him what his strongest memory of the war was. He didn't say Normandy. He didn't say Nijmegen. He said, watching the British boys across the river at Arnhem. The journalist asked what he remembered about it. Robin said, "I remember thinking that I was looking at men who had decided something in advance. Something the rest of us were still working out. I couldn't name it then. I'm not sure I can name it now. But whatever it was the most serious thing I have ever seen." That phrase. The most serious thing I have ever seen. It appears in different words in American account after American account of Arnhem. Not the most heroic, not the most impressive, the most serious. As though what the British paratroopers were demonstrating was not a feat of arms, but a quality of conviction that most of the men watching had never encountered concentrated in one place at one time. The British First Airborne was evacuated across the Rhine on the night of the 25th of September 1944. Of the 10,000 men who had dropped 9 days earlier, approximately 2,400 made it back across the river. Nearly 1,400 were killed. 6,800 were taken prisoner, many of them wounded. The bridge was never taken. The Rhine was not crossed at Arnhem. Market Garden failed. And yet the Americans who were there, who watched it happen, who spoke to the survivors, who read the reports, almost unanimously described what they had witnessed not as a defeat but as something else, something harder to name. Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the American 18th Airborne Corps, wrote in his memoirs that the conduct of the British First Airborne at Arnhem represented the highest standard of military professionalism he encountered during the entire war. He wrote that the word courage was insufficient, that what First Airborne had demonstrated was something closer to a collective decision made before the battle began, and never once revisited regardless of what followed. That decision, made in training and doctrine and culture, and the particular British habit of treating the worst possible outcome as simply another operational variable, is what the Americans at Arnhem were really reacting to. They had seen brave men before. They were brave men themselves. What they hadn't seen before, and what they couldn't quite stop thinking about afterwards, was men who were brave in that particular way, quietly, without announcement, without any apparent expectation of recognition or relief. Men who held a bridge for 9 days not because they thought they were going to win, but because the bridge was still there and they were still alive, and those two facts together meant only one thing to them. The war ended 8 months later. The men of 1st Airborne who survived were quietly absorbed back into the army, then back into civilian life. Most never spoke at length about Arnhem. The ones who did spoke in the same tone the Americans noticed. Factual, understated, precise, as though what had happened was simply what had happened, and making it larger than it was would somehow diminish the men who didn't come home, but the Americans remembered. Decades later, in letters and interviews and memoirs and the quiet conversations of old soldiers, the same image kept surfacing. A burning building across a river, a flag still flying from a rooftop that had no business still standing, a radio transmission continuing from a position that every operational calculation said could not still be transmitting, and men who, when asked why they were still there, answered the same way that British Sergeant answered Wirzbowski all those years ago, not with a speech or a declaration, just with the truth of where they were and what they had been told to do, and the understanding so deep it barely needed saying that those two things were sufficient. That was what Dale Robbins saw across the river. That was what Roy Fitzgerald heard in the radio traffic. That was what Harold Cooper carried home from Nijmegen and thought about for 24 years. Not bravery in any form they had a ready word for. Something older than bravery. Something quieter. The most serious thing any of them had ever seen.